They say one small act of kindness can change a life, but what if it could change two? This is not just a story about giving up a seat on a plane. It's about courage, dignity, and how compassion plants seeds that grow in ways we never expect. Sarah Miller never imagined that one quiet choice, handing over her first-class ticket to a stranger, would bring an entire convoy to her doorstep, and with it, a harvest of gratitude that would change her life forever. Tonight, let me share with you a story that proves kindness is never wasted. If you believe in the power of kindness, I invite you to stay with me through this story. And don't forget, follow, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Every story grows stronger when it's shared. The morning mist clung to the edges of Sarah Miller's small Georgia farm, curling like pale smoke around the fences and empty rows of earth. Sarah held her chipped mug of coffee close to her chest, letting the warmth seep into her fingers as she leaned against the old wooden gate. For 29 years, this had been her world. The cracked barn roof she patched herself, the stubborn soil she coaxed into vegetables for the Saturday market, the silence that lingered after her parents passed. She was proud of it in her quiet way. But sometimes at night, when the stars scattered wide across the sky, Sarah longed for something bigger. Something beyond the dirt road that had always led her home. That longing stirred again when a thick, cream-colored envelope arrived one spring morning. Inside was a wedding invitation from Amanda Clark, her old college roommate, and tucked in beside it was something Sarah could hardly believe. An airline ticket to Seattle, bought with Amanda's frequent flyer miles. "You're coming, Sarah. I won't take no for an answer," Amanda had scrawled at the bottom. Sarah's heart thudded. She had never been on a plane, never left the small circle of counties that bordered her farm. The very thought of navigating airports and boarding passes made her stomach twist, but beneath her nerves grew a spark of excitement. Maybe, she thought, it was time. 2 weeks later, she stood inside the tiny regional airport with her boarding pass clutched like a lifeline. Her best jeans, a clean flannel shirt, and freshly polished boots made her feel a little more prepared. Though the crowd of travelers rushing past spoke a language she didn't understand. Codes on blinking boards, quick glances at watches, voices crackling over loudspeakers. Sarah found her gate and settled into a hard plastic chair, staring at the runway where planes rolled like great silver beasts. For a farm girl who'd never left the county fair, this felt like another planet. "Excuse me, miss, is this seat taken?" She turned to see an older man leaning heavily on a cane. His right leg was stiff, barely bending as he lowered himself into the seat beside her. His hands, scarred as if from burns long ago, gripped the handle. A battered army cap shaded his face. Sarah shook her head quickly. "No, not at all," she said, moving her bag aside. The man gave a quiet nod, but said nothing more. Around them, other passengers shifted away, their eyes flicking toward his injuries and then away again. Sarah knew that silence. It was the same silence that had followed her father in his last years battling cancer. The silence of people unsure how to act, so they chose not to act at all. She offered the stranger a gentle smile. After a long pause, he returned it, the corners of his mouth tugging upward beneath the shadow of his cap. The boarding call came over the loudspeaker. "Flight 223 to Seattle, now boarding." Sarah rose, smoothing her jeans. Her ticket read Group 3, but before she reached the gate, a smiling airline staffer waved her aside. "Miss Miller, congratulations! You've been selected for a complimentary upgrade, first class today." Sarah blinked, stunned. "Are you sure?" "Positive. Enjoy your flight." Her heart fluttered as she stepped toward the priority boarding line. The thought of wide leather seats and quiet service felt almost dreamlike. Yet when she glanced back, she saw the man with the cane struggling with his worn duffel bag, limping slowly toward the economy section. 14 hours to Seattle, crammed in the middle of a row. Sarah hesitated, her fingers tightened on the boarding pass. Then, before doubt could talk her out of it, she turned back. "Excuse me," she said softly, weaving through the line toward him. "Sir, would you like to trade seats with me?" He froze, eyes startled under the brim of his cap. I couldn't." "Please," Sarah insisted, holding out the ticket. "You deserve a little comfort." The crowd around them grew still, passengers openly watching. The veteran's eyes flickered with something unspoken. Relief, pride, and exhaustion tangled together. Slowly, with a trembling hand, he accepted. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rough with something deeper than age. Sarah smiled. "Have a good flight, sir." She walked back toward the coach section, sliding into a narrow seat between strangers. Already her knees brushed the seat in front, the air smelled of recycled breath, and the aisle buzzed with restless passengers. But her heart felt strangely light. The long flight stretched ahead. Her seatmate snored with his mouth open. A child across the aisle dropped a tablet every few minutes, each crash echoing like thunder. The food was forgettable, the coffee bitter. Yet Sarah found herself buoyant, imagining the veteran in first class, his scarred hands finally resting on a soft armrest, his tired body eased by comfort he hadn't expected. At one point, stretching her legs, Sarah walked past the curtain dividing economy from first class. She glimpsed him again. He wasn't asleep like the others. He gazed out the window, posture more relaxed, shoulders lighter. Their eyes met. He gave her a nod, not of thanks this time, but of recognition, a soldier's respect. Sarah nodded back and moved along, her chest warm. When the plane landed in Seattle that night, exhaustion buzzed through the crowded terminal. Families reunited, luggage carousels clattered, strangers rushed past. Sarah never saw him again. No name exchanged, no goodbye. For a fleeting moment, she wondered if she should have asked. But then she realized some moments are precious precisely because they end before they grow complicated. Amanda's wedding was everything Sarah hadn't known she needed. Music, laughter, strangers who welcomed her like family. She allowed herself to breathe, to dance, to taste the sweetness of a life beyond the farm. And when she boarded her flight home a week later, cramped in economy once more, she didn't mind at all. She carried with her the quiet joy of knowing she had done the right thing. For Sarah Miller, that small act of kindness seemed to be only a memory, a bright thread woven into her days. She didn't know that life had already begun to change, that the gift she had given away freely would return in ways she could never have imagined. The wheels of the plane touched Georgia soil again, and with that, Sarah Miller's brief adventure seemed to end. The familiar rhythm of her life returned as though nothing had shifted. Dawn still broke over the pastures, roosters still called across the yard, and the stubborn land demanded the same attention as always. Yet Sarah noticed that her days carried a quiet afterglow. Somewhere across the country, a wounded veteran had traveled in comfort because she had given him the seat. It was a memory she carried like a small flame, tucked safely behind her ribs. Amanda's wedding had filled her with laughter and warmth, but the moment she set foot on the farm again, duty took over. The leaky roof still needed patching, the old tractor sputtered whenever she tried to start it, and spring chores stretched from sunrise to sundown. Sarah didn't complain. Work had always been her companion. Still, at times, she caught herself smiling for no reason at all. She thought of the man's rough voice when he whispered thank you, and of the way he had stared out the window in first class, shoulders finally at ease. Weeks passed. The memory slipped deeper into the fabric of her life, until it became one more story Sarah never told aloud. She figured kindness didn't need an audience. It was enough that she had done the right thing. One Saturday morning, a cold wind swept across the fields as Sarah pulled on her jacket to head outside. The chickens squawked impatiently, waiting to be fed, and the barn's sagging door groaned when she tugged it open. The storm last spring had half collapsed the roof, leaving her to patch it again and again. She told herself it would last another season, though in her heart she knew it wouldn't. She kept moving, keeping her hands busy, ignoring the ache of wanting something more. That morning, however, the ordinary sounds of farm life were broken by something else entirely, the deep rumble of engines. At first Sarah frowned, assuming the neighbors' teenage sons were tearing down the road in their pickups again. She stepped onto the porch, coffee mug in hand, ready to wave them off. But it wasn't the neighbors. At the end of her dirt drive, dust rose around 3 olive-green Humvees, their bulk unmistakable even in the early light. Soldiers in crisp uniforms climbed out, their boots crunching against the gravel. Behind them idled a black SUV with government plates sleek and out of place among the farm fields. Sarah's breath caught. She gripped the porch railing, heart thudding against her ribs. And then she saw him. From the lead Humvee stepped the man she thought she would never see again. He no longer wore the battered army cap and carried himself differently now. Shoulders straight, chin lifted, his limp softened by strength rather than defeat. His dress uniform gleamed, medals pinned across his chest. In the gray light, his presence seemed almost larger than life. For a moment, Sarah couldn't move. Her mind reeled between disbelief and awe. The quiet stranger she had offered her seat to was not simply a veteran. He was Colonel James Carter of the United States Army. He smiled when he saw her, and the smile broke through the formality of the scene. It wasn't the reserved, haunted expression she remembered from the airport. It was warm, genuine, carrying years of unspoken gratitude. Sarah stumbled down the porch steps, her voice failing her. I don't understand, she managed at last, half laughing, half terrified. Colonel Carter stopped before her, boots polished, uniform pressed sharp. "Miss Miller," he said, steady and kind. "It's good to see you again." Her words tangled. She glanced at the soldiers standing in formation near the convoy, at the government SUV idling in her driveway, at the medals glinting on his chest. It all felt impossible. "What's going on?" Carter's smile deepened, as though he had expected her bewilderment. With a nod, he gestured to the SUV. A man in a dark suit stepped forward, earpiece tucked behind his ear, posture crisp. He handed Sarah a heavy envelope, bowed slightly, and retreated without a word. Her fingers shook as she tore it open. Inside lay a single sheet of paper, embossed with the gold crest of the United States Army. The words swam before her eyes. Certificate of recognition for an act of extraordinary kindness and humanity toward a veteran of the United States Armed Forces. The Department of the Army extends its deepest gratitude to Miss Sarah Miller. Her actions embody the spirit of compassion, respect, and dignity that every soldier fights to protect. Sarah blinked, breath catching as she read the final line. Presented by Colonel James Carter, 3rd Special Forces Group Airborne. She lifted her gaze, stunned. "You're a colonel?" Carter inclined his head, almost sheepishly. "You didn't know who I was," he said softly, "and that's why it meant so much." Before Sarah could answer, movement at the convoy caught her eye. Soldiers were unloading crates from the Humvees, long planks of wood, fencing, and tools clinking against one another. Her confusion deepened. What are they doing? Carter stepped aside, his voice carrying the calm certainty of command. "We brought you something," he said simply. "A few things, actually." 2 soldiers carried a heavy crate toward the porch, while others stacked lumber beside the barn. Sarah shook her head, bewildered. I don't understand." The colonel's expression softened. He took a step closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You gave me something precious," he said. "You gave me dignity when I felt invisible, comfort when I was weary. You saw me, not just my scars. That seat may have seemed small to you, but it meant everything to me." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tightening. "It was just a seat," she whispered. His reply came with quiet insistence. "Not to me." Behind them, hammers clinked and voices rose as soldiers began their work. The barn that Sarah had fought so hard to keep standing was suddenly alive with motion. Men working in practiced rhythm, the creak of boards being lifted, the steady thud of nails driven into place, the sound of a structure being reborn. Sarah stood frozen at the edge of her porch, the certificate trembling in her hands, the reality of what was unfolding too large to grasp. Colonel Carter turned once more toward her, his voice touched with a hint of humor. "We're going to rebuild your barn, Rutt," he said. The words hit her like a rush of wind. For months she had fought to keep the barn from collapsing completely, stretching her meager savings, patching what she could. She had whispered prayers into the rafters when storms rolled through, begging the old beams to hold one more night. And now, standing before her, was an entire unit of soldiers, men who had faced deserts and battlefields, repairing her farm as if it were the most important mission in the world. Sarah pressed a hand to her mouth, overcome. "You don't have to do this," she murmured. "We want to," Carter said simply. His voice carried no hesitation, only certainty. The sun broke through the gray clouds then, lighting the fields in a wash of gold. For the first time in years, Sarah felt as if her world was no longer small, no longer bound only to the weight of survival. Something larger had found its way to her dirt road, something she could never have expected. She looked back at Carter, at the metals shining across his chest, at the scars that no longer seemed to define him but instead marked him as a man of endurance. A man who had once been a stranger, but who now stood before her as a living reminder that kindness never disappears. It circles back, stronger than before. And in that moment, Sarah realized life was about to change again in ways she could not yet imagine. The morning air filled with the rhythmic clang of hammers and the low hum of voices working in unison. Sarah Miller stood at the edge of her porch, her jacket pulled tight around her shoulders, unable to believe what her eyes were telling her. Soldiers, real soldiers who had fought wars halfway around the world, were scattered across her small farm. Some carried heavy planks toward the sagging barn, others unrolled spools of wire for fencing, and still more measured beams with the precision of men used to completing a mission together. Colonel James Carter moved among them with quiet authority, his presence commanding yet never harsh. He offered a word here, a nod there, and the men responded instantly, their movements sharp and sure. Sarah felt almost dizzy, as if she were standing in the middle of a dream that had taken shape without her permission. When two soldiers passed by carrying a crate stamped with military markings, she found her voice at last. "Colonel Carter," she said, stepping closer, "I don't understand. Why are you doing this?" He paused, looking at her with steady eyes that softened as he spoke. "Because you gave me something no one else could," he said. "On that plane, I felt invisible. I had just left another round of burn treatments. Most days I didn't feel like a man anymore, just a scar people avoided. But you saw me. You gave me your comfort, not because of my uniform, not because of rank, but because you thought I deserved dignity." Sarah's throat tightened. She tried to speak, but he lifted a hand, gentle yet firm. "It may have been a seat to you. To me, it was proof that I was still worth kindness. That reminder carried me home. And when I told my men, they didn't hesitate. They wanted to honor what you did. So here we are." Behind him, laughter broke out as one soldier dropped a hammer and another teased him with good-natured banter. The sound filled Sarah's yard with a warmth she hadn't felt since before her parents passed away. She blinked back the sting of tears. "But a barn, this is too much. You can't—" Carter's smile was quiet, almost mischievous. "We've faced harder rebuilds than this. Trust me, Miss Miller, this one is a joy." From that moment, the day blurred into motion. Sarah carried pitchers of lemonade and trays of sandwiches from her kitchen, the least she could offer, while the men worked with steady precision. She hovered near the edges, marveling at how quickly the broken structure transformed. Rotten beams were cut away, new timbers lifted into place, nails driven with confident strikes. The barn that had sagged like a tired old man now rose straight and proud again. At one point, as Sarah handed out drinks, she found herself standing shoulder to shoulder with Colonel Carter, both of them watching the barn take shape. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. He turned, his scarred face lit by the sunlight. "You already have. When you gave me your seat, you spoke louder than words ever could." From his pocket, he pulled a small, weathered coin. He placed it in her palm with a weight that felt heavier than its size. "This is a challenge coin," he explained. "It's passed between soldiers to honor acts of valor, loyalty, or brotherhood. It's not given lightly, and it's rarely given outside the service." Sarah turned the coin over, her fingers trembling. One side bore the emblem of the 3rd Special Forces Group. The other carried a simple phrase, "Deeds, not words." Her breath caught. "But I'm not a soldier." "No," Carter said gently, closing her fingers around it. "But you acted with the same spirit we live by. You gave without expecting, you honored someone you didn't know, and you reminded me of what we fight for. That's worth more than rank." For a long moment, Sarah couldn't speak. She stared at the coin, the sunlight glinting off its edges, then lifted her gaze to meet his. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You already said it," he replied, "when you looked at me and didn't look away." By late afternoon, the transformation stood complete. The barn, once on the verge of collapse, now towered strong and straight, its new timbers gleaming with fresh paint. Soldiers leaned against tools, sharing jokes and wiping sweat from their brows. Sarah walked slowly around the structure, her boots crunching against the gravel, awe and disbelief chasing each other through her chest. Her father's pride, the barn that had been the heart of the farm, had been restored in a single day. She pressed a hand to the cool wood, feeling tears sting her eyes again. She turned back toward Carter. This means more than I can ever tell you. He gave her that quiet smile again, the one that seemed to carry both strength and gentleness. Then let me give you one more thing. From the inside of his uniform jacket, Carter withdrew a manila folder. He handed it to her with a slight nod. Puzzled, Sarah opened it and froze. Inside was a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs and a check. The amount written across the paper stole the breath from her lungs. Her voice shook. "Colonel, what is this?" "The guys pitched in," he said almost sheepishly. "Some came from a veterans support fund, but much of it came from us personally. We wanted to make sure your farm stays yours." Sarah's knees nearly gave out. The sum was enough not only to pay off the back taxes that had haunted her for months, but also to repair the farmhouse, replace the dying tractor, and maybe even hire help for the harvest season. It was salvation wrapped in paper and ink. Tears spilled freely now. "I can't accept this," she whispered. "You can," Carter said firmly, "because it's not charity. It's gratitude. Gratitude for what you gave without knowing who I was. Gratitude for reminding us that kindness still lives in the world." Sarah pressed the folder against her chest, overwhelmed, her tears mixing with laughter she couldn't control. Around her, the soldiers packed up their tools, loading empty crates back into the Humvees, their voices carrying across the farmyard like music. When the last nail was hammered and the final board secured, Carter approached her one final time that day. The setting sun painted the sky in gold and crimson, and behind him the barn stood tall, a monument not just to labor but to connection. He lifted his hand in a soldier's salute, then lowered it with the ease of a man among friends. "Miss Miller," he said, voice steady, "you gave me back my dignity. We only wanted to return a piece of it to you." Sarah looked at him, her heart too full for words. She managed a trembling smile. "You've given me more than I ever thought possible." Carter's eyes softened. "Then promise me one thing. Keep growing things here. Keep planting, not just in the soil but in people." "That's what your mouth to own," Sarah nodded through her tears. "That, Colonel Carter, I can promise." And as the last of the sunlight fell across her fields, Sarah realized that the gift she had once given freely had returned to her tenfold. The barn was rebuilt, her farm saved, and her faith in humanity restored. What she thought had been a small sacrifice was, in truth, the beginning of everything. When the last Humvee rolled away down the dirt road, its taillights fading into the dusk, Sarah Miller stood motionless in the cooling air. The newly rebuilt barn gleamed in the fading sunlight, fresh red paint catching the last glow of the day. In her arms, she still clutched the folder with the check and the challenge coin heavy in her pocket. The convoy's rumble quieted, leaving only the chirping of cicadas and the far-off hoot of an owl. For the first time in years, her farm felt alive again, not just in structure, but in spirit. That night, she barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, images replayed, the soldiers laughing as they hammered beams into place, the respectful nods from men who owed her nothing, the earnest look in Colonel Carter's eyes when he pressed the coin into her hand. She lay awake in the dark, whispering to herself, it was just a seat. Yet she knew now that it had never been just a seat. The following morning, Sarah rose as always at dawn. Old habits refused to yield, even after miracles. She fed the chickens, gathered eggs, and hauled buckets of water to the livestock. But each task carried a strange lightness, as though invisible hands had lifted part of the burden. When she passed the barn, she slowed, running her fingers over the smooth boards. It felt new, but more than that, it felt like hope made solid. By mid-morning, the news had already spread. Small towns rarely kept secrets, especially when a convoy of military vehicles thundered down a country road. At the market that Saturday, Sarah found herself the subject of curious glances and quiet whispers. Neighbors who usually offered only polite nods now stopped by her with gentle questions. Landry, the gruff owner of the hardware store, tipped his cap with unusual softness. Heard some soldiers stopped by your place, he muttered, as though unsure if he had dreamed it. Mrs. Greaves, the stern librarian who had rarely spoken beyond book recommendations, pressed a basket of homemade muffins into Sarah's hands without explanation. Even old Mr. Holloway, who hadn't spoken more than a grunt to anyone in a decade, looked her way and rumbled, "Good girl." Sarah accepted each gesture with quiet humility. She didn't tell the full story, not because she wanted to hide it, but because some miracles felt too delicate to be spoken of loudly. Instead, she tucked the memory into her heart, where it glowed quietly. Weeks passed, and life began to ripple outward in unexpected ways. At her market stand, Sarah tried something new. She placed a small wooden box beside the baskets of tomatoes and jars of jam. On it, she wrote in careful letters, "Take what you need, pay what you can." At first, she worried the idea was foolish, that people might take advantage of her kindness, but the opposite happened. Each Saturday, she discovered new surprises. One morning, she found a sack of freshly baked bread tucked beside the egg cartons. Another time, a handwritten note lay under her apples. "You helped my brother when he came home from the war. Thank you." And without fail, every week, an anonymous envelope containing exactly $20 appeared under her basket. No note, no signature, just quiet, steady generosity. Sarah never tried to uncover the source. Some mysteries, she realized, were best left untouched, like wildflowers blooming on their own. One chilly evening, a letter arrived in her mailbox. The handwriting was blocky and straightforward, the kind of script learned by men who had spent years writing quick notes in rough places. Her breath caught when she saw the name at the bottom, James Carter. The letter was simple, but each word carried weight. "Dear Sarah, I've been thinking about that day on the plane, about how much one small act of kindness can change a life. When I was injured overseas, I thought I had lost everything, my purpose, my place, my faith in people. You gave it back without even knowing. You didn't just give up a seat. You gave a soldier a reason to keep believing. And sometimes that's the kind of rescue that matters most. Stay stubborn, stay kind, keep growing things. If you're ever near Fort Bragg, there's always a place at my table. Respectfully, Jim Carter." Sarah folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a wooden box by her bedside, alongside her father's pocket knife, her mother's old brooch, and a handful of mementos she couldn't bear to lose. She touched the coin resting inside and whispered, "Deeds, not words." From then on, the farm was no longer just a place of work. It became a gathering point for something larger. Neighbors who had once passed by with indifference began to stop. Some offered spare parts or old equipment. Others brought baskets of fruit or jars of preserves. Conversations bloomed where silence had once lived. Sarah, who had spent so long feeling like the quiet girl at the edge of things, became a symbol without intending to. She noticed it most one Saturday afternoon when a young mother lingered by her stand, 3 children tugging at her skirt. The woman hesitated, then took a carton of eggs and slid only a few coins into the box. Sarah smiled, adding an extra jar of jam into her basket without a word. The woman's eyes filled with tears. That was the moment Sarah understood. Kindness had its own momentum. Once set in motion, it didn't stop. Autumn painted the fields gold and crimson, the harvest richer than it had been in years. Pumpkins swelled bright and heavy on their vines. Apples blushed red in the trees her father had planted long ago, and the new barn sheltered livestock safe from the first cold winds. When Sarah stood at the edge of her property, watching the land thrive under her hands, she realized she wasn't carrying the farm alone anymore. She had help, not just from soldiers who had rebuilt beams and fences, but from a community that had quietly decided she was worth standing beside. At night, when the air turned sharp and frost crept across the fields, Sarah often sat by her window with Carter's letter in her lap. She read it again and again, not because she doubted its meaning, but because each time it reminded her that the smallest act could ripple outward in ways she couldn't predict. She thought of the veteran in first class, staring out the window with his shoulders at ease, and of the convoy rolling up her dirt road. Kindness, she understood now, didn't end with the giver. It traveled, it grew, it multiplied in hands and hearts until it returned, stronger than before. And in the stillness of her farmhouse, listening to the night winds carry across the fields, Sarah Miller made herself a quiet vow. She would keep planting, not only in the soil but in people, because the world didn't just need crops, it needed hope. The barn stood tall against the night sky, its new roof gleaming under the stars. And Sarah knew deep down that the story was far from over. The ripple had only just begun. Winter crept across Georgia with a quiet hand, frosting the fields and painting the bare trees silver under the morning sun. For Sarah Miller, the season was no longer just about survival. It was about reflection. Her barn stood proud and strong, its red boards gleaming against the pale landscape. A constant reminder of the day kindness returned to her doorstep in the form of soldiers and gratitude. Inside the farmhouse, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, a stack of simple holiday cards spread before her. She had never sent them before. Money was always too tight, and there had never seemed to be a reason. But this year felt different. She sketched a quick drawing of her farm dusted in snow on each card, the barn at the center. In neat handwriting, she wrote short notes. One for Amanda, thanking her again for the plane ticket that had started everything. Another for the Veterans Support Fund, anonymous but heartfelt. And one for Jim Carter. She paused before writing his, staring at the blank card as memory stirred. His scarred hands, the solemn weight of his words, the gleam of pride when he pressed the challenge coin into her palm. At last, she began to write. Dear Jim, the farm is still standing, so am I. The seeds you helped me plant, kindness, faith, stubbornness, are growing strong here. You once told me that sometimes the right rescue doesn't happen on the battlefield. You were right. Sometimes it happens in the quietest ways, in a smile, a seat offered without hesitation, a barn rebuilt by strangers who became family. I hope wherever you are, you're still growing things too. Merry Christmas, Colonel. Always, Sarah. She sealed the envelope, carried it to the old mailbox at the edge of her property, and slipped it inside. Looking up at the wide winter sky, she smiled. She didn't need a reply. Some conversations, she knew, echoed beyond words. By the time spring returned, Sarah's land hummed with new life. The soil yielded more generously than it had in years. Rows of vegetables thrived under her careful hand. Apple blossoms bloomed white against the warming air, and young animals frisked in the pastures behind sturdy new fences. The check Carter had given her had paid the back taxes that had shadowed her for months and repaired the old farmhouse roof that leaked every heavy rain. For the first time in years, Sarah didn't feel like she was just holding things together. She was building something lasting. The Saturday market reflected the change. Her stand overflowed with produce, plump tomatoes, baskets of berries, jars of jam. The wooden box marked, "Take what you need, pay what you can," remained a fixture, and people treated it with respect. Sometimes they left more than money: a bag of seeds, a loaf of bread, a note tucked carefully under a basket. Sarah learned to look forward to those surprises, each one proof that kindness had taken root in her community. And the ripples kept spreading. One afternoon, she found a shy teenager waiting by her stand. He shifted nervously before holding out a folded envelope. Inside was a letter that read, "My brother was in your colonel's unit. He told us what you did. Thank you for seeing him when so many didn't. It means more than we can say." Sarah tucked the note into her box of precious keepsakes, her heart swelling with a quiet pride she had never sought, but deeply felt. Summer came, and with it a harvest richer than she had ever known. The barn doors swung open to reveal stacks of hay, new tools gleaming where old ones had once rusted, and livestock sheltered in comfort. Neighbors who once passed with polite waves now pulled into her driveway to offer help. One man repaired her tractor without asking for pay. A woman brought jars of honey from her hives. Others came simply to sit on her porch and share conversation, as if Sarah had become the quiet anchor of something larger than herself. She realized one evening as the sun dipped low that her father had been right about the land. It wasn't just soil, it was a bond between people. When cared for, it gave more than crops. It gave connection. Autumn followed, painting the farm in gold and rust. Pumpkins swelled in the fields, apples filled baskets, and laughter returned to the farmhouse when neighbors gathered to help with the harvest. Sarah stood in the middle of her land one crisp evening, boots crunching on brittle grass, and felt a steadiness in her chest she hadn't known in years. It wasn't only about the barn. It wasn't only about the check. It was about something deeper, something winter could never freeze. Hope. That Christmas, Sarah's mailbox filled with cards of her own, neighbors, customers from the market, even strangers who had heard whispers of her story. She answered each one with gratitude, though the letter she kept closest was still the one from Jim Carter. His words had rooted inside her, just like the crops in her fields. Years might pass, she knew, before she saw him again. Maybe she never would, but it didn't matter. The bond between them lived not in visits or conversations, but in the shared truth that kindness, freely given, was never wasted. One evening, standing by the porch railing, Sarah thought back to that first moment at the airport, the scarred man limping with his cane, the crowd shifting away, her own sudden decision to give up her seat. She realized then that kindness doesn't wait for the perfect moment. It doesn't calculate cost or weigh reward. It simply acts, trusting that the smallest deed can carry farther than we ever imagine. And indeed, her life had been proof. That one seat had grown into a barn, a community, a farm reborn. It had restored dignity to a soldier and hope to a woman who had almost forgotten how to dream. As the last snow of winter dusted her fields, Sarah leaned against the porch, arms crossed loosely over her chest, watching the farm she loved breathe in quiet strength. The barn stood tall against the horizon. The fields stretched wide, and the community pulsed with life around her. She whispered into the cold air, "Kindness never really ends. It just waits for its season to bloom." And as the stars scattered across the night sky, she knew she would keep planting, not only in the earth, but in the hearts of everyone who crossed her path. Because kindness, once sown, never stopped growing. In our darkest moments, it still finds a way, often in the quietest places. And for Sarah Miller, that quiet place was a farm in Georgia, where a seat given freely had grown into a harvest of hope.